But now to introduce our speakers. Susan Clutter received her master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. She has worked as a CSI for the Montgomery County and Baltimore City Police Departments and Maryland before she became a college professor in 2003. She's taught at various colleges in Maryland and Virginia and has taught forensic courses for the Virginia Fire Marshal Academy and the State Department. Her areas of specialty include crime scene investigation, blood pattern interpretation, and fire science. David McGill is with us as well. He received his MFS in forensic science at the George Washington University as well. He has over 2 decades of forensic examination experience and has a specialization in footwear and tire track examination. He currently works as a program manager and system administrator for the track evidence system at his local Department of Police. And he is also a Police Training Commission certified instructor. And he has published several research articles on crime scene investigation. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Leggie Boone is a forensic analyst for a sheriff's office in Florida. She has been involved in forensic sciences since 1993, including overlapping years as a crime scene investigator and educator in Baltimore, Maryland. When her daughter was born, she began teaching full-time, and this inspired the pursuit of her master's degree in forensic science. In 2008, she moved to Florida, where she returned to crime scenes and was recruited to become a forensic analyst with her current agency. And in addition, these three have just recently co-authored a book, So You Want to Be a CSI, which is available through Kendall Hunt Publishing Company, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. I think I can speak for everyone when I say that we're all extremely interested in what you have to say today.
Thank you. An honor.
Good to be here.
Well, with all of your experience and all of your credentials and accolades and everything, I think it's important for us to first know how each of you came into the field. How did CSI call out to each of you individually? David, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. So for me, I really didn't have plans on going into crime scene investigation. That was not my original plan when I started my college career. Partway through my college career, I kind of pivoted from where I was headed and started heading towards a law enforcement career, intending on becoming a police officer. And in 1992, when I graduated, the job market was terrible. There was really no jobs kind of in the government sector. So that was not an option at the time. I had taken a course in criminalistics in my last semester of my undergraduate career at University of Maryland. And criminalistics is basically what today we refer to as forensic science. And I really enjoyed the coursework, and it was very interesting to me. So in order to stay ahead of the next graduating class, which was going to be my next competition for more jobs that didn't exist at the time, I made the decision to try to move forward to my master's degree. And the only university that was local to my area that offered a program in forensic science was George Washington University. So I applied to that school, and to my surprise, was accepted, and completed that degree, and then was fortunate enough to actually land my first job and get moving in the field.
Wonderful. Susan, I know that you attended George Washington University as well. How did you come to be a CSI?
Yeah, Dave and I overlap a lot in our careers. We both went to the same forensic program for our masters, and we both worked out of the same police department at one point in time. We also went to crime scene school together. But that's kind of where it ends in terms of how we got into the field. I knew I knew very early. I'm a little unusual in that I knew very early what I wanted to do. When I was 6 years old, my uncle was murdered in a botched robbery attempt. And so from a pretty young age, I knew that I wanted to do something in law enforcement or the criminal justice system. And so I think I was thinking policing or detective work. And then when I was 10 years old, my parents took me on a tour of the FBI building, which at the time, both headquarters and the lab were in Washington, D.C. And we had a tour of part of the tour took us through the crime lab. And there was plexiglass between us and the laboratory. And I saw a lab analyst who had a lab coat on, and he was looking at what looked to be a bloody twig under a stereo microscope. And I didn't know what he was doing, and I didn't know what his job was called, but I knew that I wanted to do that. And so eventually that led me to forensic science, where I got an undergraduate degree in biology, because at the time, DNA was just dawning. DNA analysis was just dawning. And so I thought that biology would be the way to go. And then after going to work in Baltimore City, I ended up picking my master's up later when I moved over to my next employment.
Wow, that's a really amazing backstory. It's incredible that you knew from such a young age that that's what you wanted to do.
Kind of bittersweet, yeah.
Definitely. Leggie, how did you come to be a CSI?
Divine intervention. I was on the road to either working with animals or dead people. And I had the opportunity to work with animals after I finished my undergrad degree in biology and worked at the Baltimore Zoo. It's a different name now, Maryland Zoo now, I think. But the Baltimore Zoo, I worked there for a couple of years. And while I was there, I met someone who turned out to be a neighbor who works for Baltimore City's crime lab. And he recommended that I use my biology degree to consider working crime scenes. He showed me pictures and told me more about the job, and I applied. It took a little time because of hiring freezes and different things that were going on in that process. But a couple of years later, I did have opportunity to start working with the city. And while I was waiting, I assisted at the medical examiner's office as an autopsy technician volunteer. So I'd come in a couple days a week and assist with the autopsies and dissections of different victims, different persons. And that helped me to get to know some of the detectives and some of the other personnel coming down to that area to work with the bodies. After some time in crime scene work, I was able to move over to Baltimore County as a supervisor, and different circumstances and the birth of my daughter changed life. So I decided to teach for a little while. And while I was teaching, I got my master's degree at National University. And that was primarily online because school's in California. But it all brought me back to crime scene work when I relocated to Florida. And now I'm still working more of the evidence and examination portion of it.
So there's definitely similarities and differences with kind of all of your journeys here. They all seem to kind of at least center around Maryland, Baltimore area in some regard.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that you guys met and are colleagues today. David, you mentioned being a cop. Is it required and necessary to be a cop to be a forensic investigator?
No, it's not. Back many years ago, the standard was that most crime scene investigators were sworn police officers, but that has really changed quite a bit with the kind of the specialization that goes on with crime scene investigation. As well as there's financial advantages as well for departments to not have the crime scene investigators be sworn. So a typical police officer training is going to be anywhere from 6 to 8 months of academy training. And field training after that, as well as having to equip them with all their specialized equipment, their vehicles, their firearms, and so on and so forth. If they're also going to be a crime scene investigator, well, that's going to be probably another upwards of 6 months of training to be ready to go out and start handling major crime scene events. So rather than investing all that time and equipment in police officers and then also investing the crime scene portion in them, it really makes more sense to bring people in that already have that specialized background in education, and can hit the ground running a little bit more, although it does still require that training to really get up to the where you need to be to do the job in the field. But that's been the real evolution that's happened over, I'd say, the last 20 to 30 years in the field.
Sure. So say someone is, maybe going into college or, looking for a career change, and they don't necessarily have any kind of previous experience with this sort of subject matter. What would you suggest for an educational track that they pursue?
Do you want me to address that?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So at a minimum, most programs now, it wasn't true back years ago, but most programs now, or most job opportunities now in the crime scene investigation field, are going to require at minimum a bachelor's degree. That wasn't true back in the mid 90s, but today that's pretty much the case. So at minimum, it's going to be a bachelor's degree with a concentration in sciences, preferably a forensic science, but any science will certainly help you get in the door. Advanced degree is also beneficial to you if it's possible for you to continue on that path. If it's not, then I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your local police department and try to get involved in their crime laboratory as a volunteer. A lot of crime labs will, in fact, do ride-alongs with people. Now, there's limited as far as the type of crime scenes that people will be allowed to enter. Will be, of course, subject to the circumstances and the local department of what they're willing to bring in on. But getting that experience and getting hands-on experience will make a big difference when you are actually trying to compete with other people that are just coming at it with a bachelor's degree alone, or even a master's degree. Even if you have a master's degree, but you have no real world experience at all, even that internship can really make a big difference. And the other thing that was actually pointed out to me by Susan recently was that even if you're not able to get in with a crime laboratory, even if you're able to just get laboratory experience, that is also a really strong benefit. So even if it's working in any laboratory setting, that can go a long way in making you stand out, because the competition for crime scene investigation positions is pretty significant. It didn't used to be that way, but now there's a lot of applicants per position. And so you do need to make yourself stand out.
Sure. I know, Leggie, for part of your experience, you actually have been recruited into jobs. Do you have anything to add to what David was saying about how competitive the field is? How does someone kind of fresh out of school break into the field?
Sometimes it is connecting with somebody you know, and that helps, or making yourself known to that lab, getting that leg in as an intern, as a volunteer, with some form of lab work. I volunteered at the medical examiners, and my roommate was the young lady who would come and collect the cornea for the eye bank. So we both were in the medical examiner's office every few days doing something and getting to know whatever detectives from every agency that used Baltimore, Maryland's system for their medical examiner needs. So it helped just being seen and connecting with those different people. So just a willingness to talk to different people who are doing the things that you're interested in, that definitely helps.
Sure. I know that before you started teaching full time, and you had a daughter, you were kind of doing all sorts of stuff. You were doing some CSI work, and then you were doing some adjunct training. So once you get into the field, what do the hours look like? What's your typical schedule, and what's your salary, if you don't mind my asking that?
Back then, I got to chime in, right? I came in right before Susan did, and in 1993, the starting salary was $23,500. Now, and that was in Baltimore City. In Florida here, I just checked yesterday just to make sure I'm up to date. The starting salary for the CSIs is $35,415, and that's a whole lot of difference between Florida and Baltimore, but that's a huge difference for the young person coming into this field with very little experience. The benefit Baltimore did have after 2 years and going through several hoops and things, you could bump up from 23,000, to 32,000. So it was a good place to be if you don't have a lot of obligations when you first come into the field. And the hours for us, we rotated shifts every 2 weeks, all 3 shifts. So it was 24-hour operation. And I like the rotating shifts, but the quickness of the rotation, you couldn't get used to. Your body was not able to get used to being on midnight shift one day and on 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. The next day. It was a little difficult, but we did it and we survived, and it was fun at times. So Susan or Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a young person's field when you're dealing with that kind of shift work where you're every 2 weeks. But I will say that shift work allows for your salary to be higher than your base because you're dealing with things like shift differential pay. And you're also dealing with where if you're working evenings or you're working midnights and you happen to be called for court, all your court time is overtime. And that coupled with the fact that there's frequent mandatory overtime where, you get off in 36 minutes and some dude dies and you have to go and, deal with that homicide. Perhaps the only silver lining in that scenario is that that's overtime for you. You're definitely going to be working another several hours on that scene, but you are working at time and a half. So the base salary is relatively low, but there is, the likelihood that your base salary is not going to be your actual gross. That combined with what Leggie was talking about, where there's opportunities for advancement. Some agencies, the one Dave and I worked in after Baltimore, was you had an opportunity to supervise a shift. And so that also was sort of a pseudo management position where your salary went up with experience and responsibility.
And let me add on to that real quick too, as far as where the salary that you're going to make really depends upon your experience in the location where you're working. Yeah. If you're coming into an inner city environment that's a really high volume work environment, then your salary is probably not going to be real high, but your experience level that you will gain very quickly is well worth your time spent there. And then that will make you very competitive for other positions within the field, and even still doing potentially still within crime scene specifically out in some of the outlying suburbs that may pay significantly more. I know the jurisdiction that I went to in my second move as a crime scene investigator, and my last actually, was to a location where I made significantly more money than where I started out originally. But the experience that I gained at the original location was absolutely essential.
So with so many CSI and cop related shows nowadays, I think that sometimes that can kind of tend to color our perception of, what reality is and what isn't. So one of my biggest questions for all of you is the job dangerous? Susan, what's your experience?
Well, I would preface that answer by saying I think a lot of the danger depends on where you work and what the policies of the agency are. when I worked in Baltimore City, I think I would check the box on dangerous. We were working in a city that even at that time had, 325 murders a year. So there were shootings all around the city. And we were 24/7, which means we were, on the streets of Baltimore at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. By ourselves. So there was an inherent danger there. Also, the police are not well liked in the inner city. So we had that going for us as well. And we also were driving to all our scenes. And because we were so busy, we were driving pretty much our whole day was spent in the crime lab van, driving from one scene to another. So you have the inherent possibility of increased risk of car accidents. You also have, no matter where you work, you have the hazardous situation where you're dealing with blood and semen and saliva, which can carry diseases. So you've got to worry about, infectious disease. And then you have the kind of the mental aspect of the work, which can be draining, and there is burnout. There is PTSD. We know that now. So, that sort of is not something that a typical cubicle IT worker is going to have to deal with. That having been said, I will say that working as a CSI in a suburban environment was much safer in the long run. We didn't work alone. We weren't out on the streets by ourselves at all hours of the night, as usual. Rarely we were, but not on a regular basis. The shift work was a little different. So we weren't changing every 2 weeks. So, we had a little bit of a safer experience.
Sure. David, Leggie, what's your experience with that? Have you experienced different things, or is it pretty much goes in line with what, Susan is?
A lot of it's definitely true. It depends on your location, but also there's structural hazards. There have been more than one occasion where a CSI or detective has fallen through a floor. And because the weak structure or rotted building, or you just don't know what kind of circumstances you're entering in when you're going to certain scenes in different areas of whether it's city or county or suburban. It just depends on the quality of that structure. So you have to be aware of everything you're stepping into and just conscious of a lot of different things that you normally wouldn't be conscious of for your personal safety. And that mental stability piece, that mental health is a definite thing to be aware of when you're coming into crime scene work, because you're going to see a lot more than you normally would have seen in any other job, even more than the average police officer, because you are a smaller group of people going to a wider range of scenes. And that officer may see 1 or 2 homicides in a month, possibly, and he's not going to be in that scene for as long as you're going to be there. And then you're going to see maybe 5 to 10 homicides in that month, and of all different natures all over your city or in different areas. So it's a lot more to be cognizant of. Yes.
Sure.
As far as to expand or bounce off something that Leggie said, I agree. The safety can be really dependent upon the type of scene you're on as well. I mean, like if you're dealing with a fatal fire situation or something like that, you can be going into structures that are, literally substantially burnt away, and where you're having to work with firefighters and fire investigators, and in some cases even structural engineers, to find out, have things been, secured? Are things safe to enter? Where are the safe places to walk? Because it's not a question of whether there are or aren't unsafe places. There definitely are unsafe places. It's a matter of where can you walk. You may be climbing up, big ladder trucks to get aerial or overhead photography photos. So you can be, climbing up quite a distance up in the air to get perspectives that people wouldn't typically get. So your average day as a crime scene investigator, and believe it or not, it does become average. I mean, it does become a normal part of your day to be standing on a death investigation scene saying, "Hey, where do you want to go for dinner?" I mean, that's a normal part of your day because you see it all the time. And as far as the other danger, I mean, in the years that I was in, I would say that the two incidents that were very similar that really kind of stood out in my mind was there was two incidents on two different murder scenes. Well, one was on the scene and one was at another location where I had what turned out to be the person who committed the murder standing with me and no one else around, no other sworn personnel around, I should say. And where it can, I'm not saying that's a normal thing that's going to happen. It's not. But at the same time, if you spend enough years doing the job, you're going to inevitably find yourself in a dangerous situation at some point. That's just the nature of the job.
Sure. Kind of the common theme that I'm hearing from everyone is you do a lot, you see a lot, and every day is just it can be completely different. Even though it does become something of a routine, every day is completely different. So with all of the things that you've seen and done, what are some of your most celebrated cases? But then what are also some of the cases you're most proud of? Because I understand that they're not always the same thing. I know, David, when we were talking about today, you were like, well, just Google David McGill and sniper case. And so that makes me think that maybe that has something to do with one of your most celebrated cases. What's your input on that?
Well, by celebrated, if you mean infamous or well-known, then yes, the sniper case is probably the case for which is the most notorious case that I've been involved in, or the most well-known case. And for those who are younger at this point, they may not have heard of that case, actually, because it was all the way back in 2002. But it involved two individuals who were, well, we thought just in the Washington metropolitan area originally. Turns out they were doing it across the entire country. But they were shooting people at distance most of the time with high-powered rifles. And it went on for quite a period of time. In the Washington metropolitan area, it went on from October 2nd through October 23rd of 2002. And it involved not just the location that I worked, it was also several of the surrounding jurisdictions as well. So it turned into a lot of federal support came out involved in that case, and it was all resources on deck. I mean, there was just millions and millions of dollars being poured in by the federal government and resources and everything else to try to bring that case to a successful conclusion. With that being said, though, that's not the case I'm most proud of being involved in at all. I mean, I really believe that in that case, any competent CSI would have been able to do exactly what I did. I mean, there was no special skills that I brought to that scene other than a lot of hours and a lot of work, but there was nothing special about that scene that I did specifically. As far as the scene that I would say definitely stands out to be the one where I'm most proud of, where I feel like my involvement in the case made a huge difference, was actually 2 years prior to that. So it was in June of 2000 when Monsignor was killed inside of a church rectory. And the reason I think that my involvement in that case made a big difference was because of my footwear tire track background. And in that particular scene, it was an indoor murder scene. There was footprint evidence that was identified in blood in the scene through chemical enhancement. And once we were able to chemically enhance those impressions, we were able to develop a suspect. We were able to identify a footwear pattern specifically and identify it to a specific shoe, a manufacturer. And this case had a pretty big impact on the local area because of the fact it was a Monsignor that was murdered. I think it put a lot of fear into the public. And we actually created a wanted poster for a shoe, believe it or not. And there was a lot of, there were investigators going around literally looking at shoes what the people were wearing, trying to identify a potential suspect. And ultimately, we did get a phone call about somebody who was became a person of interest. And the way they were ultimately, the probable cause was developed in that case was the person went into a bar and was having a drink in the local area, and an undercover team was sent into the bar, and they were asked to identify the shoes that this person was wearing. And they were able to initially look at the upper portion, which is the part you would see, not counting the bottom of the shoe. And they believed that they had the right person. And then they were told, no, you need to get a look at the bottom of the shoe before we're going to feel comfortable with this. And fortunately, sitting on a bar stool, the suspect finally put their foot up onto the bar stool, and they were able to see the bottom of the shoe. And at that point, they knew they had the right person, and probable cause was established, and search warrants were obtained. And ultimately, that person was convicted of that murder. So that's the case that I think stands out the most for me, because somebody that didn't have my specialty in that particular scene, the outcome may not have been the same.
Sure. Wow, that's amazing how specialty can play into getting a convict. So it's a blessing that you were there for that case. Susan, how about you? Most notable versus a case that you're most proud of?
You know, I would have to agree with Dave that my most notable case is probably the sniper as well. And that's ironic because I never actually worked a particular crime scene in that case. My role was going to the medical examiner's office and working with the medical examiners on the first victim that Montgomery County had. And while I was there, 5 more people were killed that day. And so I had to go back to the medical examiners less than 24 hours later to work on the other 4 victims that ended up in the Baltimore medical examiner's office. And specifically, we were looking to try to figure out trajectory, because nobody could see the shooter. And we knew that they were using rifles. So we thought that there was the possibility that they were on rooftops. And the trajectory that we worked on in the medical examiner's office determined that, in fact, no, they were from a slightly lower position. So we started thinking about, okay, maybe they're in bushes, or maybe they're even in sewer drains where we can't see them. They're taking cover. And of course, it turned out to be that they were in the trunk of a car, mostly hidden in a trunk of a car. I would say the case I'm most proud of is one. I'm proud of the cases where I've taken somebody off the street that has committed multiple crimes. So in Baltimore, I was proudest of a fingerprint hit on a 40 beer bottle that was found near a scene where a person got dragged into a vacant house and sexually assaulted. And that turned out to be a serial rapist. So my finding the fingerprint on that bottle ended up being part of putting a name with a DNA profile and getting him incarcerated. And then in Maryland, in Montgomery County, my most celebrated case, or the one that I'm, I guess, most proud of, was a person who was babysitting and claimed the child fell out of their baby seat, which is suctioned to the bottom of the tub, and drowned. And I was on the crime scene and knew almost immediately that this wasn't a drowning, because the baby seat was still suctioned up to the wall. And so I ended up taking the baby seat back to the laboratory and photographing dust on the bottom of the baby seat to prove that it wasn't murder. And this person in question actually had, it turns out, had killed another child prior to this one. Same fashion, claimed it was a drowning, and he was actually choking them. And unfortunately, with the first child, they were looking at the mother. And so the police didn't know exactly what had gone on. And so we ended up putting him away. And so I'm proud of that, he's not going to be killing any more kids.
Yeah, there's that personal ownership of being able to
Yeah,
literally make the city safer.
yeah, some satisfaction there.
Sure. Leggie, how about you?
I had opportunity to participate in the Joseph Palzinski cases in Baltimore County. And this was a young man who suffered from bipolar disorder, and he had been misdiagnosed or never fully treated properly. Not as an excuse, but he had a history of violent behavior and abusive nature towards women mostly. He ended up going on a spree killing and killed 4 persons and then took a family of 3 hostage. And during the hostage situation, he eventually, after a long period of time, I want to say 12 hours, which is pretty long for a hostage situation, excuse me, but he ended up releasing one person at a time, and someone slipped him a Xanax at the time that he was keeping them there, and that kind of disoriented him and allowed the police to get in there, and he ended up being killed by the police officers. I want to say he may have been shot over 20 times. Because he was fully armed and he was violent, but it was a scene that I was part of the scene of his final moments, his after the barricade situation and his death. As far as scenes that I'm proud of, it wasn't specifically the resolution of cases. It was more the feeling that I got from helping citizens when they were in their most vulnerable moments, when they're going through something really a huge struggle for them, particularly those who had repeat offenses for them. There were a few, particularly one gentleman, Mr. Scott. I remember his elderly gentleman in Baltimore on North Avenue. I went to his home 4 times for burglary. He had nothing by the time I got to that 4th scene within a couple of weeks. And he was just as pleasant, and we just built up a little friendship of me trying to help him or show him how to better maybe create a different, safer environment for himself, or just hearing him out, listening to him. And he knew who was doing these things, but he just couldn't prove it. And I was not able to resolve those cases with the evidence I was getting, but I felt like I made him feel a little bit better that I was helping him out. Same thing with a deaf couple that who were burglarized. They had very little, and this is no electricity. And of course I get there at midnight when the scene probably happened at 9 o'clock in the morning. But after a long day of multiple scenes, I got there late at night, no lights, very few candles, and a deaf couple and no one there to interpret for us. But we worked it out, and I think I felt like I made that moment for them a little less, or made them, I demonstrated a lot of compassion that made them feel a little bit better that someone was doing something to try to help them. So I just took pride in those moments with connecting with those persons I was trying to help.
Sure. Now, with all of the different sort of situations you're in, and all of the things like with that gentleman that it just kept happening over and over again. What are some of the saddest things you've seen, or the most violent or disturbing, however you like to phrase it? I'm sure these are questions that you receive probably pretty frequently.
Well, one of the things I would hear is, what's the worst scene you've ever been to? And worst to me is not necessarily worst to other people, but the most graphic scene I would say would be one where a woman had an argument with her then boyfriend, and he shot her in the face point blank with a sawed-off shotgun, and her bedroom was in the basement of the house, and the ceiling was lined with plastic biohazard bags for some reason. I don't know if that was their form of insulation or she just had it covered, by chance the red biohazard bags. So the ceiling was covered with stalactites of blood and fractured skull and pieces of brain matter and a lot of things hanging from the ceiling that day. And it was a very low ceiling, so we had to be very careful. But he was definitely caught because there were family members in the home on an upper level, and they heard everything, saw him run, and even saw where he threw the firearm. So it wasn't a question of who did it. It was just very graphic in how we were so close to everything that was dripping from the ceiling at the time.
Sure. Wow. Susan, what's your experience with some of the extremes?
I always struggle with that. We get that question. I'm confident that every CSI that's ever been a CSI gets the, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? And that's a hard one because I don't know what they are looking for with the word worst. I think probably the most graphic that I've ever worked was a woman who she committed suicide by stepping in front of a train that was moving at a pretty good clip. And we picked her up, literally, we picked her up in a bucket. She was not even, we were not even able to get anything into a body bag. That was literally a trash can scene, what I would nickname a trash can scene. The saddest case I ever worked was a case that involved a father and his 10-year-old being shot to death. And unfortunately, the father was shot multiple times. He called 911. The police get there, and as they're trying to gain entry into a locked front door, they hear what they think are gunshots coming from inside. Which turned out not to be the case. It actually turned out to be that the gentleman, the victim, was at the top of the stairs. He had been shot and he was paralyzed. So he couldn't move his legs. So he was crawling, and he'd knocked a TV tray that was at the top of the stairs down a flight of wooden stairs. And so the cracks sounded like gunshots. And so it was several more minutes before SWAT arrived, before they could actually gain entry into the house. And what was so sad about it is, in addition to the fact that he ended up dying and his 10-year-old daughter died, was that the police were listening to the 911 call over and over and over again to try to figure out where the suspect exited from and what the cracks were. We couldn't figure out at the time what they were hearing. And so I'm trying to process the scene, and I'm listening to this guy, pleading for the police to come in and help him over and over and over again. And he couldn't get to his kid, and he kept, calling out her name, and it was gut-wrenching, a gut-wrenching situation.
Sure. David, how about you? What's your experience?
So I guess, again, it depends on what you're talking about. As far as if you're talking, graphically sad type cases, I think it's generally the cases that involve the young kids. I was involved in one particular case where a woman was adopting children for, I guess theoretically because she wanted the kids, but functionally, I think it was more for the financial benefits that came along with adopting children. And basically what had happened was she had 3 little girls, and she was abusing them severely, to include broken bones, brush marks, whip marks, you name it. Ultimately, she killed 2 of the girls, whether it was intentional or just as a result of the abuse. I don't honestly recall at this point in time. But both the girls were, when they died, they were placed in plastic bags and placed into a freezer in the house, a chest freezer. And so their bodies, nobody knew that they were even missing. Ultimately, the 3rd child, the remaining surviving child, she actually ultimately managed to climb out of a window. I want to say she was like 8 years old. She managed to climb out a second-story window barefoot and with hardly anything on, and made a run for a neighbor's house, and was able to get help, and that was, you know, how it went down. Her name, ironically, was Joy, and the good news is that Joy got a lot of mental health work after the fact, and last I heard, she was actually doing pretty well. And interestingly, in that particular case, of all the death scenes I've been on, the only funeral I've ever been to that involved, you know, a work-related funeral, so to speak, was that case, because there were no participants to go to that funeral. The funeral was actually put on, I believe the police department may have even helped fund that. I'm not sure exactly how that came to be, or if it was just put on by the church or whatever it may have happened. But I think virtually 100% of the attendees that were at that funeral were, you know, the detectives, crime scene personnel, the other people that were involved in that case. So that was, I would say that was a pretty brutal case as far as sadness goes. As far as just straight up grossest thing I've ever seen, I guess I never really had a specific answer to that question. For, I would say, the first, I don't know, 17 years of my career, I never really had a specific thing that jumped out to me as being the grossest thing until it happened. And ironically, that wasn't even on a crime scene. It was actually at the medical examiner's office. A woman had been killed. She was a petite woman, and she had been shoved into a green sleeping bag. And the green sleeping bag was then put in a plastic tote. And that plastic tote was then put out in the backyard of a townhouse for several days in the summertime. And that ultimately, it was a missing persons case. The crime scene investigator and the detective personnel that were on scene finally located her with the sense of smell. And the tote was transported to the medical examiner's office, where I was the fortunate one to attend autopsy the following morning. And when I got there, there was a skeletonized hand sticking out of this tote, and with still some musculature and so on and so forth hanging off of the hand. There was flies and wasps and all sorts of insect activity coming out of the tote. And at the time, at the old location of the medical examiner's office, they've since moved, but the old location, they had their decomp room, is what they called it. And quite literally, we, not to be terribly graphic, but it was terribly graphic, we poured her out of that tote onto the floor to get the liquids separating from the solids. And it was an incredibly unpleasant scene. And of course, all of those materials, like the sleeping bag and all of those things, had to be collected and transported back, because those items are in fact evidence. And so those things have to be transported back by, in that case, me, to the crime lab, where, you know, you attempt to dry them down over time and make them so that they can be packaged long term. And in that particular case, we had to turn to freezing, because there was simply no way to dry it down because of the oils and the lipids that were present in the decompositional fluids. But yes, that was by far the most graphic scene I ever dealt with, which again wasn't even a scene, it was at the medical examiner's office.
Sure.
Sucked to be you, Dave. I'm pitying you as I'm hearing that story. That's awful.
That was an unpleasant one.
Yeah. And Megan, I can say that we get one additional kind of question, saddest, most gory. We also get, what's the craziest thing you've ever seen? And I'm confident that every CSI has, craziest victim story, where, you're at a burglary and it's a hoarder, and the victim has, jars of their own urine, next to the point of entry where the person's broken in. We all have a craziest suspect, where we can think of, some suspect that is, absolutely off the wall. I remember in Baltimore, a drug dealer who wanted his drugs to be well known, So he put his name and pager number on the baggies of the drugs. Who does that? You know, we all probably have a crazy police story, you know, where just the police that we're dealing with, God bless them. I have nothing but respect for police, but some of them just be crazy, you know? And so we get, like, I remember dealing with a captain who he ordered me to take a swab of his undercover officer's car. And the undercover officer had apparently been having a relationship with the wrong woman, I guess. And somebody had poured maple syrup in his gas tank. And the captain ordered me to swab the maple syrup running down the side of the gas tank. And I'm, you know, standing there trying to explain to him, like, you know, a maple syrup database is not a thing. We, you know, we don't have Aunt Jemima's DNA on file. Like, you know, we're not going to be, none of this is going to help you figure out who damaged this vehicle. And then you had court in there. You know, we all have a crazy lawyer story, you know, and it gets to the point where you're sitting there. And again, it could be in your crime lab van, or it could be, you know, you're in court, and again, you're sitting outside the courtroom waiting for your turn, and you're having a full-on conversation with the drunk homeless guy that's sitting next to you on the bench, and he's got bubble wrap in his pants because the bench is too hard for him, and you're like envious that he brought bubble wrap and you didn't, you know, and you're sitting there, and at some point every CSI says to themselves, I'm choosing to do this. So maybe I'm the crazy one, right? Like maybe I'm the one that didn't get enough hugs, you know, growing up or whatever. And maybe I'm the one that needs the, like, you know, the mental assistance, because every day there's something crazy that happens and you question some of your life choices. You know, I'm confident Dave and Leggie have equally crazy stories.
All right, guys, she set you up. Let's hear it.
The first thing that always pops into my mind is, as far as being funny, was the me attending a scene and there's nobody there. Everybody's gone, no victim, no police. I'm just kind of writing this up as what we would have called a negative run, because it was just several hours after the actual crime occurred. But while I'm waiting, another CSI comes up and we're talking and about things that are happening in the area, whatever. And a woman hops over to us. She's hopping on one leg. She has a fluffy pink bedroom slipper on. And her other leg appears functional, but she hops a great distance, maybe 3 or 4 car lengths to get to us, just hopping. And we're just watching her hop toward us, like, what is this? What's going on here? What's happening? And she just proceeds to tell us everything she knows about what happened at this crime scene. And I don't think I heard a word she said, because I'm just steady, just seeing her hop with fierceness. And then, you know, I guess when she's, you know, we're walking away, she walks with both legs to walk away. But she hopped to us, and it just cracked me up for about at least a few days. And still 20 plus years later, I'm still picturing this fluffy pink slipper, this dirty slipper coming across the street, just coming down the street, hopping towards me. It's just like, I'm going to get you, sucker, all over that movie. Don't make me hop after you. So, but I'm sure there's plenty more in my slideshow up here somewhere. That just stands out to me as the funniest thing I'd ever seen.
Sure. David, how about you? Any comedic standouts?
It was not funny, haha, obviously for the victim, but it was funny given the circumstances, and that was the night Spider-Man got shot. A gentleman that was dressed up in a Spider-Man outfit for Halloween was on a bus a public bus, and he got into an altercation with somebody else. And when he went to get off this bus stop, somebody else followed him off that bus stop and started shooting at him. And he was shot a couple times with a .22 caliber pistol. And fortunately, he did not die as a result of his injuries, although he did have permanent lifetime injuries from it. But it was a little bit odd showing up and you know, one of those things, if you arrive on scene, and I had a detective on scene that was kind of a funny guy in the first place, and I arrived on scene and said, "So what do we got?" And it was like, "Well, we have Spider-Man getting shot." And that's kind of how the scene started. So it was an unusual one.
Man, sounds like it. Well, we're getting pretty close to the hour. So what I would like to kind of circle back to is, you know, we started out, you know, talking about each of your different specialties. So just to kind of tie a bow on everything, after all of your stories, I'd love to know what sort of training do you guys have to do to gain each of your sets of expertise? David, did you want to start out?
Sure. So for me, it started in 1997, when it was not very long after I had started my career as a crime scene investigator. And I was selected for my specialty rather than selecting my specialty. I was called into an office of somebody who was a question document examiner at the laboratory, and she said, "Hey, Dave, I want to let you know you're going to be a footwear examiner." And I was like, "Okay. Don't really know too much about that, but okay." And the result of that was that I was sent to training. It was about a 9-month training course where we met weekly and then would have assignments that we had to do. It included information about historical things with footwear, manufacturing processes, the impartation of individual characteristics into the footwear and into crime scene impressions, and ultimately how to do comparative work between not only footwear, but also tire tracks as well. And after finishing that training, then I had to complete a year of supervised casework, where all of my casework for that first year had to go back to the person who originally trained me and be signed off on by that person. And then once I completed that, I was then able to do independent casework. But again, independent casework in forensic science is still not independent, because we always deal with verification. So if I were to complete a exam where I effected an identification between a crime scene impression and a pair of shoes, I would always have to go to another examiner, whether it be the person who trained me or whether it be another examiner. And have that verification, have that identification verified through independent examination. So we never were in a situation where one examiner can like go rogue and come up with an identification on their own that, you know, is in fact a false identification, because it in fact has to be verified. So I think that's, you know, an important thing for maybe people that aren't in the forensic field that they need to understand. And that's not just the footwear field, that's pretty much any identification type field.
Sure. There's always going to be that check and balance. That's
correct.
Nice. Susan, how about you? And also, you, unlike David and Leggie, are no longer in law enforcement. So if you would also share with us why you left CSI, as well as your specialty and how you were trained for that.
Sure. Dave's story rings true with me as well, that I didn't choose my specialty. The departments chose for me. So I was told that our department no longer had a blood spatter expert. It's now called blood pattern analysis, but they sent me to a week-long school in Miami where they know a whole lot about blood spatter. And I, got my certificate, and then I worked with a mentor for several years, actually. And over the course of time working as a CSI, I did a couple of expert reports on blood spatter. And I also had an expertise, or received expertise, in fire investigation, which is trying to determine cause and origin of a fire, whether or not it's criminal, whether or not it's arson. And that was a 2-week school at the Maryland Fire and Research Institute. Again, followed by some on-the-job training and mentoring. And yeah, once I received those expertises, I worked for several more years as a crime scene investigator. And then after about 10 years as a CSI, I married, I went to have my son. And the plan was to go back to work as a CSI. But after I had my son, I really couldn't justify leaving. My husband at the time was a police officer as well. So he had equally crazy hours. And there's really, it's difficult to find someone to watch your kid at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know? And so I decided that I would take the skills and start teaching. And so I was, for the first 5 years of my son's life, I was an adjunct faculty member teaching various people at the Virginia Fire Marshal's office, working, later on I worked for the State Department. And so I did a lot of adult training, and I also worked at universities teaching students as well. Then later in 2010, I got work at Youngstown State University in their forensic science department. And that's where I've been ever since.
Lovely. And then Leggie, I know some of your experience rings true with Susan's because you started teaching full-time when your daughter was born. Is that correct?
Very shortly after, yes. And it's funny, I was also voluntold that I'm going to be a latent print examiner.
I'm seeing a trend here.
I would not have chosen, I wouldn't have chosen latent prints as my field of expertise, but because I was strong and competent in latent print development, and I had a very high hit record when it came to the latents that I was developing, I was highly encouraged to come on over to the latent print side once I did get back to crime scene work. I did leave because of scheduling and raising a child. And at the same time, the scenes with children started to look like mine. And that's no good for working crime scenes. You have to step away to shed your tears or to regroup when it comes to very young children. And well, children and elderly and animals, all those things, some things move others more than I did, than did me. But at the time it was children. So I did step away and I taught high school and college criminalistics because it wasn't forensic science back then, and was able to use teaching sort of as my own little therapy because I could talk to these young adults and older adults and share some of this stuff that we're sharing today. So that was a way to get some of this, to cope with, decompress in a sense, some of the things that we've seen over the years, aside from poetry and writing or trying to get involved in different things to not bring crime scene work home. So it was a journey, and latent print examination I've been doing now for about 10 years, coming up on 10 years specifically, and also being trained in shoe wear examination. And so it's a process, and it's a lengthy process to become a very good analyst, because you cannot make mistakes in these fields. You cannot say, this is someone's life in your hands. You don't want to consider the wrong person for committing a crime, nor do you want to have the right person running around in the streets who did the crime free. So you have to have that check and balance system in place, that verification system. So I wouldn't trade it, but that's part of what we put into our book. We wanted to make sure people knew some of the things that we've learned, or a lot of the things that we learned, some of the positive things we learned, and some of the negative things we went through to get that piece of education. And hopefully they can use that as a tool for themselves, as a reference or guide or motivation to try to do different things within forensic science. There's so many options when it comes to the disciplines in forensics. But you have to have that support system, that motivation, that energy, willingness to learn, and endurance, because it can be a stressful job depending on, again, where you are, what agency you're working for.
Sure. And I'm glad you brought up your book, Leggie, because I think you did a really great job with it, all three of you, in capturing kind of this candid nature that you're bringing us today, and just kind of laying out here, if you want to become a CSI, here's how you do it. Here's the steps you take. Susan, do you want to say a couple words about your publication?
Well, the three of us had all sort of come to a similar conclusion that the forensic science field, there were very few actual books specific towards crime scene investigation. So you had plenty of books that talked about things like DNA or the fire investigation or ballistics, but you didn't have a whole lot of actual books, that centered on crime scene investigation. And then those few books that were out there, textbooks that were out there, they were, and no disrespect to those folks that wrote them, but they were not crime scene investigators. Those authors were, some of them were lab folks, so they originated as chemists, and they ended up working in a forensic laboratory. And so they were sort of writing ideally about what a lab person wants to see from a crime scene investigator. Some of these folks had been on some crime scenes, but they were coming at it from a management viewpoint of, well, I'm a director of a lab, and so this is what we do on a crime scene. And it kind of dawned on us that none of that, while ideal, is not necessarily accurate and doesn't really portray what actually might be going on the scene. Our weather issues, the danger, the equipment problems that we've had. So we decided that we would write a real book about our experiences, so that we could make sure that the next generation of crime scene investigators were able to get a real view of what crime scene investigation was.
Wonderful. And we do have, jumping off of that and kind of, more into the experience of what's the day-to-day like and how do you get in to this field. We got a couple of questions that we'll answer real quick here. Actually, we've got quite a few questions. But we have a student named Rebecca who is going to be, she's a senior this year and she's unsure about what she wants to do when she graduates. She's currently interning with the police department, hopes to continue that. She's also interested in maybe working with a medical examiner, and she's wondering if you have any input on whether it's best to go straight into grad school for her master's or to get experience before going into a master's degree.
I would say, and from my experience only, I would suggest try to get a little experience, at least to make sure this is what you want to do. There have been several persons who've applied for the job, got the job, went through the whole background check and all of the steps of even the initial training, and that first death scene, that first decomposed body, even pictures of decomposed bodies or graphic scenes made them decide, I don't want to do this. So you need to make sure that you talk to or engage with people who are doing the things that you want to do, whether it's crime scene work or anything really, before you invest in the next level of education, in my opinion. There are too many people there's a lot of people, not too many, but a lot of people competing for these positions, and there are very few positions. So it's an investment on the agency part to train you. If you're not aware of what the job requires or how it might impact you and your lifestyle, your values, or your thinking, then it may be a waste of that energy. So I would encourage, try to get some experience if possible. The interning helps, but keep talking to those persons to make sure that's what you really want to do before you move forward into a higher level degree.
The other thing I'd like to add on to that is if you have, there's no substitute for real world experience. It's just, you can have the best professor in the world and even the best book written in the world, and it doesn't change the fact that the real world experience is probably the best teacher out there. And so if you have the opportunity to move directly into it, and it does not mean you cannot continue your educational pursuits, while you're continuing your professional pursuits. There's plenty of people who I've worked with that were doing both, working towards their master's degree while they were actually, active crime scene investigators. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But yeah, if you have, I would say jump into it. If the opportunity presents itself to you, I would jump. That would be my unequivocal advice.
I would third that motion. I'm one of the people that Dave talked about there, where I was pursuing a master's while working as a CSI, which was difficult, but I was able to do it. And my agency helped a little bit financially with grad school. They paid a stipend for books, and they also assisted with transportation. I got a discount riding the metro back and forth from Maryland to DC. So don't underestimate the fact that the police departments, depending on which department you're with, or the agency that you work for, may assist you with your scholarly activities.
They also might offer incentive pay for when you get your degree. After you've earned it, you may get additional dollars in your paycheck for earning or having your bachelor's or earning your master's along the way. So that might be something else to strive for once you get into a law enforcement agency.
Definitely. Another question that we have is from Gary, and he says that he's found that many departments don't want students working with CSI students. And you guys have mentioned volunteering and the benefit of that, and interning with labs. And so do you recommend getting into private labs, or what types of labs would you recommend to get that experience?
Yeah, I can say that as a professor, we've had that problem where police departments are very reluctant to have anyone intern as an investigator for two reasons. One, nobody should be on the scene if they're not actually actively working the scene, because they're a source of potential contamination. And two, because of the dangerous aspect of the investigation itself. Nobody wants to take on that liability if it's not a worker. But we at YSU, for example, we have a lot of internship opportunities for folks to work in medical examiners' offices, not just in the morgue itself, but as medical legal death investigators, which is a good way to get onto some potential crime scenes. You're not working for the police department, but you still are investigating crime scenes. What is the temperature of that scene? Is it an indoor scene? Is it an outdoor scene? What does the body look like? Livor mortis, rigor mortis, algor mortis. These are all things that that assist, and it is real world experience that you can put on your resume.
So I would add to that it is true that years ago it was much more common to have people, actually to a certain extent, even hands-on with some evidence, in an internship capacity. And, the accreditation that most laboratories are now subjected to, or I would say even most laboratories are subjected to, has really changed the ability to incorporate people that have that interest in any type of hands-on work. It really has hamstrung that aspect of things. However, don't sell short while you may not be able to have hands-on in an internship capacity, you're still would have most agencies, I think, at least the ones I've been around, will allow you to at least be present. And so while you may not be the one actually, dipping the paper in anhydrine or putting the evidence in the glue chamber or picking the cartridge casing up on the crime scene, if you're permitted to be present for those things, you're still learning. And more importantly, it gives you the ability to put on your resume, as long as you're very careful and honest about how you place that information on your resume. I mean, integrity is an incredibly important aspect of the criminal justice field as a whole. So this is not a field where you want to stretch your resume. Make sure that you can back up what you're saying. But you can say, I have been present, or I have attended scenes. I have, been present during evidence processing and those kind of things. And those buzzwords that you're able to honestly and legitimately articulate in your resume and in a potential interview situation may very well be those key words that are being looked for that are going to give you that opportunity to get the interview that may give you the opportunity to get the job.
Perfect. And then we'll take one more question today. Mitra says, I'm a legal historian who teaches a course on the history of forensic science. Students are always asking how to get into the field, but most of them are doing their undergrad in humanities and social sciences versus a scientific field. Is there a career path for people coming with non-scientific undergrad degrees?
Maybe in would it be in the legal nature or the criminal justice background, or possibly a specific thing like photography, or learning more on the first thing that jumps into my mind is criminal justice or legal studies. So that would be the first, other than straight science. What do you think, Susan or Dave?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think students can get lucky by finding the occasional job as either a CSI or a medical legal person, or, as Leggie mentioned, a photographer, working in a crime lab, for instance, dealing with photography, without the science. But that is becoming more and more difficult as time goes on. The cornerstone of forensic science is science, and a hard science. So chemistry, biology, physics, math. And the reason why the investigation requires that stuff is because a lot of our scientific work that we're doing on the scene is based in biology and chemistry and physics. Moreover, a lot of the folks that become CSIs end up going into the laboratory to do additional advanced work in forensics. So they may move into the ballistics lab, or they may move into the trace lab, or the chemistry lab, or as Leggie did in the latent fingerprint section, where science is required. So it is getting more and more difficult to find jobs for people who are not getting a 4-year degree in forensic science or something in a solid science discipline.
And Mitra followed up saying that their students' background is legal studies majors with criminal justice certificates often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for me, I guess I was a little bit different because, again, I didn't know I was going to want to move into the forensic science disciplines until the very end of my undergraduate degree. So in fact, my undergraduate program was criminal justice and sociology. So I was that humanities person in undergraduate. And, I was able to transition, through my master's degree into the forensic science arena. But I still think, today, I would still say it's best to pursue more of an evidence, or excuse me, a hard science background would be preferable. I don't think a criminal justice degree is going to knock you out of competition, but honestly, if it's, you know, I think it's going to give you a leg up to have that hard science aspect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone so much for your time today and just your willingness to come and share stories that so many have an interest in. We really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor.
Thank you.
And thank you for everyone who attended today for joining us for this webinar. If you have any further questions about the author's publication or the webinar itself, you can contact Jamie Ledding at jledding@kendallhunt.com. We'll be following up with a recording of the webinar. And oh,
Here's a picture of our book. Buy our book. There's more fun stuff in here.
There's
My plug in the back.
Shameless plug.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone again for joining today, and we hope your day is a great one.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.